Hello, everyone, and welcome to one of our book talks that we will be having with the SAS Society over the next few years. And I would like at this point to introduce Dean Krouk, who will be introducing our speaker today, who has written a book that he will be talking about. By all means, our Dean Krouk is a professor. Krouk is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and is also the editor of the Society's journal.
Okay, so I guess I'm supposed to introduce Klaus now. It looks like Kimberly is back. Let me, yeah. Kimberly, I'm not going to be able to make you an attendee, but I'm just going to proceed here. So, Claus Elhom Andersen, as I'm very glad to introduce, my friend and collaborator and conversation partner and Nordic program colleague, is the Renata Madsen professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Department of German Nordic Slavic. And we've worked together before on Knausgård related things. A special issue of the journal Scandinavian Studies that came out in 2020 was something we did together. And Klaus has spoken widely and published widely on Knausgård and contemporary fiction. So his new book is something that we're all very glad to have in our hands in the case of me, the Knausgård and the Autofictional Novel. So we'll be talking about this book today, and without further ado, I think we'll just jump into the questions. So Klaus, are you ready to get started here? I think we should. You. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Lena Lee for inviting me, for you for hosting and interviewing here, and Kimberly for doing all the technical backstage.
Great. So first, we would like to know a little bit about how the book came to be and the background story of your interest in Karl Ove Knausgård and issues of fictionality and autofiction.
Yeah, I guess there's probably two possible answers to that question, right? One is about the topic, why Knausgård, and maybe also one is about process. And I'll see if I can maybe address sort of both of them. I published my first article on Knausgård as early as 2013, and while I haven't worked on my struggle constantly ever since, right, it has made up, as you mentioned, right, a significant part of my work ever since. The special issue with that, my dissertation, and also an anthology that I edited 2017. And I think as many readers, I was drawn to my struggle because it challenged so many of the things I took for granted in literary studies. What is a novel? What is fiction? And originally I came to my struggle from a post-structuralist, formalistic perspective, where autobiographical writing in and of itself is more or less always considered fiction. And that was actually my approach in my dissertation for 2015, right? Where in a good formalist manner, identified what I call the central paradox of the novel, and that I defined something like that Knausgård wants to write honestly about himself, but only can do so in the form of the novel. And because of that, right, I said it is basically fictional. But in my new book, I tell the anecdote of how meeting Knausgård actually led to a change in my reading of my struggle. It was at a symposium at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, where I years ago had been invited to give a talk on pan-Scandinavian literary history. And there I included a final section on Knausgård in my talk. And I remember I stressed in my talk back then that my struggle to me was just like any other novel. And it made no difference to me that the protagonist of the novel happened to have the same name as the author, because that was not what made it interesting, I argued. But then when I finished and then my talk, and I went to lunch with the organizer and some of the other participants at the symposium, Knausgård had who had also been invited to the symposium, but whose flight had been delayed, came to the lunch, and he sat down next to me and Monica Fagerholm, the Finnish-Swedish author that I was sitting talking to. And the two of them started talking, and I sat listening to Knausgård and Fagerholm, adding a comment here and there. And then I really started rethinking the relationship between the man sitting next to me and then the protagonist by the same name in the novel. And of course, I recognized traits in him that I recognized from the novel. But it was also accompanied by the exact opposite feeling that I, in fact, didn't know anything about the man sitting next to me. And this, I believe, is where I realized that I had been wrong in my reading of My Struggle that morning at the symposium, right? That it certainly does matter, but in a complex, ambiguous interplay between the two, matters that the author of the novel is the same as the character, and that, in fact, is part of what is most interesting in it. If I just return a little bit to process then, right? The problem was that I didn't know how to actually write this new insight. And it was really much at odds with my formalistic approach. And I tried to write, when I came here, a book proposal, and I wrote a disposition, but I simply didn't know what to say, right? I knew there was something that I found interesting, but I didn't have the theory, I didn't have the vocabulary, I didn't really have the approach. So my second summer here in Madison, I simply just started writing. And I set the goal for that summer of writing at least 1 page a day. And if some days I wrote less, right, I would have to write more the following. And that actually led to 75 pages at the end of the summer that clearly spelled out which areas I needed to read in. And it also gave me a direction for the different chapters. And it's not more than 2 months ago, I actually found that original document. And I was surprised to see that most of it, though, like expanded, edited, and rewritten, has made it into the final book. And then the final aspect, I think, of the process that I also really want to acknowledge here is having amazing friends and colleagues that can give feedback at different chapters from an early stage, right? Many of those I can see who are attending here today have read early versions. Dean, you have read quite a lot and commented on that. And I think it's such an important lesson that when we write, it's important to get that feedback. Unrelatedly, last week I was in Denmark, and I was meeting an old friend who teaches writing classes for dissertators at several universities. And he told me that none of the students he works with share their work with their peers, right? They don't have anyone read it. And I think that's incredibly sad, because good scholarship, right, comes from conversations, discussion, feedback, critique, reading and discussing each other's work and sharing it, right? And I'm eternally grateful to all of those who have read along the way of the book, and it couldn't have happened without them.
Great, and that is so true about the need to share work with peers and develop ideas with peers. And I've been very glad to be a part of that with this project. And I think when we move into the argument of the book, I want to get at something that you said in your comments about how meeting the flesh and blood author Knausgård led you past an approach that you called formalist that you had been using, and led you to rethink the ideas of fictionality. So that's intriguing. And I think if we can delve into some of the concepts at the center of your book, we might be able to understand why that occurred in that way, and what the major insight was that you had upon meeting Knausgård, and how that played out in the theoretical development of key concepts in the book. So before we even get to the concept of autofiction and the term autofictionalization, which is your coinage, I think we need to talk about fiction and the different meanings of the term fiction that are present in ordinary conversation, also in literary theory and literary scholarship, and that play a role in your book. Can you disentangle some of the meanings of fiction? The realization you reported about meeting the flesh and blood Knausgård was a realization about fictionality in a way. So maybe you can tell us, what are the meanings of this term that a reader of your book should bear in mind?
Absolutely, right. I mean, my exploration of the term, right, my reading is actually what came from writing that particular summer. That was, I need to read up on this. This is an area that I do not know as much about as I want. And of course, what you find is that there's a multitude of definitions at play, and I use various of them in the book. I think if we look at a dictionary, and I believe I actually quote the OEG definition in my book at one point, right? Fiction is defined as something invented and untrue and related to literature that describes imaginary people or events, right? But what does that mean? Is then the big question, right? The Oslo, for instance, in Jo Nesbø's Harry Hole novels, and even some of the events and then the people in those books are, as Troil Moy at one point pointed out, right, are very real. Yet the novels are fiction. And that, of course, raises absurd questions of how much fiction does it take to make a discourse fictional? And the absurdity of that, I think, is really spelled out by the Swedish author Jan Guillou, who at one point claimed that if 3.5 of a book is fiction, everything is to be considered fictional. And 3.5% is simply the amount of salt it takes to make drinking water into salt water. Right? So that is his argument. If we turn to literary scholarship, we generally find two approaches to understand fiction that are somehow related. One is what Marie-Laure Ryan has termed pan-fictionality. That is the post-structuralist approach where everything is considered fiction. And here we can take the example of Paul de Man and his autobiography as defacement, as I also discuss in the book, where he argues that there's no such thing as autobiography because it is in essence just fiction. And then we have, related to that, but also somewhat separate, we have the more formalist approach to fiction, right? That is that there are certain formal signposts in a text that can help us distinguish between a fictional and a non-fictional discourse. And in my book, I show how Timothy Buse, who's a scholar whose work I otherwise really admire and have learned from, in a reading of my struggle, identifies what he believes is free indirect discourse. And because of that, concludes that my struggle is no different than any other novel, and that it doesn't matter that protagonist happened to be called Karl Ove Knausgård. He could just as well be called Joe Smith. If we take a step back from these understandings, right, we also have fiction as a generic marker, right, that is historically based. Here in the book, I engage Catherine Gallagher's really influential, commanding article, The Rise of Fictionality, and where she describes the birth of the intimate relationship between fiction and the novel, and how she, right, as she says, how the novel discovered fiction, and how fiction became a category in its own right, distinct from fantasy and lies. And that description, right, she turns to the English novel, the 18th century, the change from Defoe to Henry Fielding, where the non-referentiality of proper names, right, that names are fictional and do not, as is the case of Robinson Crusoe, pretend to reflect an actual person, had that paradoxical effects that they led to greater referentiality, that it became easier for us as readers to identify with it. And in the book, I argue that Knausgård, he challenges that basic assumption of an intimate relationship between novel and fiction, that not only in the is established in the 18th century, but also something we find in major theories of the novel ever since, whether that is Ian Watts or Jameson or many other. The third understanding of fiction in my book is the one I probably turn to the most, which is a rhetorical understanding. And here I build on the work of James Phelan, Richard Walls, and Henrik Skov Nielsen, and their notion of fictionality. And what they claim in their very much debated article, 10 Theses on Fictionality, I think it's called, about fictionality, is that fiction is not a discourse that is cut off from reality, but actually a means for negotiating with and engaging with the world we live in. And they ask us to think of fictionality as a communicative act and not a question of representation. And especially Richard Walls and his book, The Rhetoric of Fictionality, right? He uses relevance theory. That is where he claims that we evaluate an utterance on its relevant before we evaluate its true value. Right? That became an important aspect of my reading of Knausgård and became a way for me to move beyond the dichotomy fiction and reality that seem to permeate so much of the theory of the term.
Great, thank you. That was extremely helpful as a lay of the land in terms of how literary scholars have been defining these terms. So you move beyond the idea of the formalist signposts and narratological terms. You're not interested in fiction merely as a historically determined generic marker. And it sounded like you also don't really believe in the idea of panfictionality in the sense that all textual representations are fiction. And you have a really interesting critique of Paul de Man's autobiography as defacement in the book that I would recommend people reading, because that is really well done. So aligning yourself
and I
with,
think, I think if I might just, right,
sure.
and I mean, Gallagher, right, who we normally associate with new historicism, and has this historical approach. What I show in a reading of her work is that actually when we really zoom in and analyze her work, it turns out she's a formalist too, right? That what she uses to distinguish a fictional discourse from a non-fictional are the exact same signposts of fictionality that Dory Cohn talks about. I don't think Gallagher will be particularly happy for that, but my point just is that when we push these theories of fictionality, right, they seem to turn into one or the other of the true camps that I explained.
Great. So could you say more about the idea of fiction as it relates to a contract or pact with the reader? Because that's another important idea in the book that is probably most closely connected to the fiction as rhetorical understanding that you presented in the Phelan et al. Work. But that's a key idea in the book. So can you just touch on that briefly too before we talk about autofiction?
Yeah, there is. I turned several times to a paragraph in book one of my struggle, and I should say many of my readings are recurrent throughout the books and throughout the book, and many of them are from the first 30 pages of my struggle. It's not because I haven't read all 6 books, but I really think so much of it is established there. And one of the paragraphs that I really analyze several times is where the 8-year-old Karl Knausgård steps out in the evening and takes in everything that happens. What he experiences is the salt in the northerly breeze, as he says, right? The sound of a car in the distance and the lights that comes into view. The neighbor who takes off his working gloves and then drives the wheelbarrow across the lawn, right? All these sensory impressions, and it's very much the senses, both smells, vision, and sound, that of course create a hyper realism, right, in narration, but at the same time raises the question, I think, is, but how can anyone remember that much, right? How can Knausgård remember this much? And I think we know that he can't. And he puts all these signs in the novel throughout, right, where he tells us to distrust his memory. No, I can't remember that. I can't remember that. And my point here is that what my struggle and autofiction does, right, it challenges Philippe Legion's distinction between a autofictional pact and a novelistic or fictional pact. What Philippe Lejeune claims is that when we read a book, right, and this is what he does in the autobiographical pact from 1973, is that we sign contextually a pact with the reader, right? If we pick up an autobiography, for instance, this is my struggle here, and we see the author's name, and that corresponds to the author's the name of the narrator and the protagonist, and if there are markers like autobiography or memoir, then we read it autobiographically. But as we read it autobiographically, we look for signs that undermine that contract and would have us say, oh, this can't be the case. And then we are thrown into what he calls the novelistic pact, right? But just the same way when we read novelistically, we look for signs for autobiography. And to Lejeune, these things cannot exist side by side, right? You read either or. And my claim is that in terms of autofiction, in terms of my struggle, we do actually read both ways at the same time. The autobiographical and the fictional and the novelistic pact, they exist side by side and do not undermine each other. And I think that is really an important mode of reading when reading autobiography. And I think it's something that really reflects how readers have responded not only to my struggle, but to other autofictional novels as well.
Great, thank you. And because you were mentioning Philippe Lejeune and his work on the autobiographical pact from the late 70s, could you fill in for us a detail there about how the term autofiction itself originated as a response to Lejeune's theory?
I mean, that's at least the story we hear again and again, right? That he created a field. He makes a little figure in his book, right, with different fields. This is the kind of books. And then there's one of them that is left blank. That is the thing that the author and the protagonist is the same, but that it is a novel. And one of Lejeune's good friends was the French author Serge Dubovsky, and they corresponded over the years, and that correspondence has been published, so we can go in and read that. And what Lejeune said, right, is that he wanted to try to fill that field in that Lejeune left blank. And that's what he did with his book Phi that came out in 1977, and where he defines and coins, at least that's what we'd like to say, the term autofiction, right? As novels from real life, fiction or autofiction is what he calls it there. And that sort of is at least the story of autofiction as we like to say it, even though, right, I mean, and that's one of the things that where I'm in debt to Myra Bloom, who has discovered, right, that the term had already been induced here in the US by the scholar Paul West for several years, and occurred in a number of articles that he authored.
Great, thank you. So it is a term with a longer history than something arising at the time of Knausgård's writing of Mein Kampf. And your book also argues that the moment of autofiction associated with Knausgård has a certain kind of historical context related to the phenomenon of reality hunger, to use David Shield's book title. And you connect that to the financial crisis of 2008 as you provide a historical setting for the emergence of autofiction as it is relevant to Knausgård and Ben Lerner and Rachel Cusk and Sheila Haidt. So can you tell us a little bit about that contextualizing move and why you think the financial crisis of 2008 becomes a relevant moment for understanding this century's interest in autofiction?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we go back, right, it's and look at the theory of autofiction, right? And as you said too, right, it is, we have to keep in mind that this is a term that in a French context has been heavily theorized for a number of decades, but it's also been, both in terms of Dubrovsky, who kept defining it and championing it, very much related to postmodern literature. And my argument is that what we see today is a shift, something new, and that seems to happen around 2008, 2010. And what has always surprised me is that most scholars, when they attempt to historicize autofiction, right, they historicize the term, relating it to Dubrovsky and his book and his disagreement with his friend Lejeune, and not really historicize it in terms of why writers started found new ways, new modes of expression at certain times, right? And as I mentioned, right, it is clear to me that something happened to the autofictional novel after 2008, right? From previously being seen as this postmodern genre, novels published after 2008 are decidedly not postmodern. They use a lot of the postmodern techniques, narrative hybridity, fragmentation, metafiction, and so on. But they seem to embrace a newfound belief in authenticity and sincerity. And also, right, it is quite conspicuous that Knausgård, he actually started writing My Struggle on February 28, 2008, in the midst of the financial crisis. And literally just a few weeks after the word subprime had been named Word of the Year, and something that was widely reported in all major Scandinavian newspapers at the time. And my argument in the book is that the financial crisis showed what critics had long claimed, right? That a whole financial system is based on what Marx called fictitious capital. And this, of course, is on top of a historical development through the 90s, where the political discourse increasingly had been divorced from reality, and where we first learned, for instance, the term like post-truth. And even though post-truth was coined, I believe it's 92, it didn't become dominant in discussions of politics until the wake of the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, when Colin Powell, right, infamously presented the facts, right, of the case against Saddam Hussein. Facts, of course, that turned out not to be facts at all. And then we have the 2016 election of Donald Trump, as well as new paradoxical terms as fake news, truthiness, alternative facts, and many, many others. And all of this, I argue, has led to what David Shields calls a reality hunger, and Marx, at least to a certain extent, right, an end to postmodernism. And here I also invoke Jameson, who talks about what happened in the financial crisis, right, and the explosion of fictional capital as a new historical moment in itself, right? He seems to suggest that we have moved beyond something, moved beyond postmodernism, although he doesn't really incorporate that other places in his writings. But in the book, instead, I turn to the two Dutch scholars, Vermeulen and Van der Acker, and they're writing on metamodernism, a term I'm not particularly crazy about, but at least it gives us a way to talk about something after postmodernism, right? And where they have suggested a connection between current crises, that is the dot-com crisis, climate crisis, and the financial crisis of 2008, and a new commitment to reality, right? And I think it is, with their work, has become a viable term to describe what comes after postmodernism, right? And they argue, right, that the financial crisis, like instability, uncertainty, have revealed that the postmodern years of, what do they say, plenty and prestige are long over. Yeah, I think that's, did that answer that question?
Yeah, thank you. I guess that that definitely answers the question and helps us see what you're doing with that historical context in the book. I mean, if there's been many deaths of postmodernism heralded in this century, and there are a lot of different ways to choose an anchor point for that. And as you were pointing out too, with reference to Marxism and the Marxist tradition, it didn't take the financial crisis of 2008 for people to think of the economy as consisting of fictions or fictitious capital in a way. And there are all sorts of ways in which that could have been realized much earlier by certain people. So it seems like your point is that it becomes enough of a mainstream view for a broad swath of the population to have this kind of hunger to go beyond the fictions of a highly financialized economy and the fictions of discourse, or the fictions of everything as text that people associate with postmodernism, rightly or wrongly. So that moment came around the time that Knausgård started My Struggle in your story,
and also at the time where both Sheila Hady started writing, and Rachel Cusk and Ben Lerner, right? The three authors I also include in the book.
Yes, and the question I was building up to is, why is Knausgård such a central figure? Is it just that his book is the longest one of these, or what makes him the most sort of definitive author of that autofictional moment, and 10 years ago or so?
The monumentality, right, is definitely part of it, right? And then there's also some of the formal characteristics that he is really radical in the use of. And here you mentioned earlier, right, that I coined the term autofictionalization. And I think the radicality of how he uses autofictionalization is another reason why he really has been pushed to the vanguard. And if I should just briefly explain that term, right? I use the term, coin the term, to describe a certain kind of narration associated with autofiction, and especially with Knausgård, right? And here I should add, I build on the work on some amazing scholars who have written on Knausgård, narrates his former self as if it were a fictional character. For instance, Paul Behrend talks about Knausgård writing about himself in the first person, the way you would normally write about yourself in a third person narrative. And Martin Hägglund says that Knausgård is not just remembering, right, but he's actually reliving the past in his narration. And so what I try to do, I try to show how Knausgård, through autofictionalization, places the voice of the narrative consciousness, not with the character, as we've come to expect in autobiography or in memoirs, right, but with the former self. And I analyze a number of different episodes here. One is also one where I build on Paul Behrend's insight, which is in book one, where the young 8-year-old Knausgård goes out and tells his father about a face he has seen in the surface of the water on a newscast. His father is working in the yard work, and he's really excited, the 8-year-old. So he runs out, but just before he turns the corner, he stops running, and because he's not allowed to run outside. So he tells his father about what he has seen, and just as he's about to move back in, the father stops him and says, "And Karl Ove, remember, no running." And then the 8-year-old, right, raises the question, how did he know I had been running? And he turns to this several times in the narration. How on earth did my father know I had been running? All along, right, the aging narrator knows very much well why it is, because we are being told 4 or 5 pages later that the 8-year-old then discovers that the father must have heard his steps running on the shingle through the open window in the house. And here we really have an example, right, of the consciousness. The knowledge of the narration is purely with the 8-year-old. Even though the narrator knows what is coming, he doesn't reveal it. And my point is that Knausgård uses this to an extreme extent. Sometimes the distance between the two eyes, right, his narrating self and his former self, is long. Sometimes it is short. Sometimes he uses insights so we as readers also know what is to become, what is coming, right? And for Knausgård, and that I think is a lot of the strength of the novel, right? It becomes a way to make the past present, as if certain events in the past were happening here and now. And then it adds drama to the narration, right? And I think simply his radical use of autofictionalization at various degrees throughout the 6 volumes, right, is simply just a governing narrative trope in the novel.
Great, thank you. And I'm glad we got to the term autofictionalization. And so as that certain kind of narrative technique that you were describing, it's the prevalence of that autofictionalization throughout Knausgård's work that really distinguishes him as the foremost figure of this moment of autofiction for your book. Although the others, Ben Lerner, who I am especially fond of, and Rachel Cusk and Sheila Heti, are also using that technique at times, but not in the same way as Knausgård.
Yes, yeah.
So I do want to return to something you were saying about the newfound authenticity and sincerity of Knausgård's work, against the image of a kind of everything is fiction, all is discourse, sort of playful pastiche-filled postmodernism. There's a desire for authenticity or sincerity or radical honesty that you locate in Knausgård's work that is part of reality hunger. Why would somebody have to stop writing fiction to achieve that?
I don't know if you have to stop writing fiction, but I think at that precise historical time, right? And this is what Knausgård writes about. This is what all the other writers that I engage with write as well, is how the world was inundated with fiction, right? Fiction was everywhere. And they felt that fiction had lost its meaning, that it was just adding another layer of explanation of fictionality over something that was already fiction, right? And there is a belief here, we can call it naive, at least post-structuralists will call it, but naive, that there must be something true, there must be something beyond that I, as a writer, can grasp and can get into. And here, I think, is where we find the turn away from fiction, right? And I think what is interesting for all the writers that I analyze is that turning to autofiction becomes a response to writer's block, where they simply have been writing for years, trying to write a new novel, trying to write typical fiction, but simply have found that it is stale. Yeah, and so I think it's very much to do with the historical moment, and I think the first step of that process for us as literary critics is that if we want to understand the radicality of what they're doing, we have to take seriously their challenge to fiction. And as mentioned, what I have seen several scholars do is that they either dismiss autofiction as something that has already been done, either as fiction or as just the latest trend in creating a sense of authenticity that is nothing but superficial in terms of a postmodernist way of reading. So yeah, the historical moment here, I think, is very important.
Great. I think we have time for one more question from me before we move into the attendees' questions. So there's a really, really good chapter in your book called A Son of Shame. And I wonder if we can talk about the term shame and as it pertains to your understanding of Mein Kampf, My Struggle, and what role does shame play in your reading of Knausgård in that chapter, but it also kind of seeps out into the questions of fiction and reality that we've been talking about. So maybe you can illuminate that for us a little bit before we move on to the participants' questions. Yes,
I mean, shame, as I analyze it in the chapter you're talking about, which is chapter 3, is present, I believe, in two ways, right? I argue that it's both a named explicit shame, but it's also an unnamed shame that we find in the novel's very form. The first kind is the one we see that the character Karl Knausgård experiences throughout the novel. And first of all, I think the shame he experiences, it's always something that he tries to hide. It is not visible. It's something he sees alone. Is at odds with what a lot of the theory that we find on shame today, where shame is seen as something that is visible and is a clear sign, right, of the discrepancy between the inner and the outer, that they come in conflict with each other. What shame does is what I analyzed then with Agamben, is that it is simultaneously a de-subjectifying experience, right? You feel as if you are losing your own self. But at the same time, as you feel that, it also becomes paradoxically a subjugating, right? It creates a subject because you're in the midst of losing it. And that, I argue, right, is where Knausgård instills a subject in his novel that leads him to an existential quest, and there turn to an analysis of the existential quest of the novel, which I think is rather central and something we need to talk about if we want to explore and understand the novel, and something that Martin Hegel would write in his book Real Life, or Real, it's not called Real Life, what is called?
This Life?
This Life, thank you.
Yeah.
Also engages with. The other shame, which is the form of shame, right, which is the unnamed shame, is something I see in the contrast between the ethical and the aesthetical in the novel. The aesthetical is the engagement with reality, right? Knausgård wanting to write honestly about himself at all costs. But then on the other hand, right, we have the ethical, the consequences of what he's doing to his loved ones, to his family, to his uncle, that we hear a lot about, right? And what I see, and especially in book 6, is I see a tension between these two things, two entities, right? The shame in the that is the result of the conflict between the ethical and the aesthetical, and that I then relate to the end of the novel, right? Because then the ending of the novel, of course, poses up the question of how is Knausgård supposed to end this novel, right? He has set up for himself this very high bar. I want to write 20 pages a day, right? I want to write a novel that is 3,000 pages long, and I want to do it in a year. And by doing that, right, he expands the conflict, right? He creates the conflict that is central to the novel between the conflict between family and writing. And his only way to move beyond to that formalistic shame between the ethical and the aesthetic is to, as he does in the last sentence, give up writing, right? And that what he does, right? He can turn to his wife and tell them, I will never do this again to you, and I will never, ever be a writer anymore. So that's how I incorporate shame. And as you said, right, it is mainly in chapter 3, but that conflict between the ethical and the aesthetic is something that, of course, spills out throughout the book.
Yes, wonderful. So thank you for that clarifying answer. And I hope that people who are interested in what you were just saying will take a look at those chapters in the book, chapter 3 and other chapters that deal with those issues. It's fantastically interesting. So we will move on to questions now. And I did see Kimberly's hand just went up, and I'm not sure if that was a sign that you have a question or that we should start taking questions.
I do not have a question. That was me testing to determine how it works. So
Okay.
if you do have a question, you can either type your question into the Q&A field, and you should have the option at the bottom of the screen to do Q&A, or if you have the option to raise your hand, that'll alert Dean that you have a question.
And may I just say, right, I mean, the book, right, came out Friday, and if you go to, it's published by SUNY Press, State University of New York Press, and if you go to the website, you will see that right now it's horrifically priced at $99. But SUNY has a holiday sale, so if you go to the checkout counter, there's actually a 50% off throughout the month of December. That makes it a little more affordable. And then the book will also in June come in a paperback version that will be less than $30. Just
Excellent to know.
Advertisement here.
That's good to know. So yes, do your holiday shopping now, and one copy of Knausgård and the Autofictional Novel for each night of Hanukkah would be great. So let's see if there are questions.
Dean, can you see the Q&A box?
Okay, now I'm seeing the Q&A box, and I see William Johnson's question first. So I'll read that out. It says, I am really learning from your book so far. In the e-text version, I think we are always modern, a constantly growing, inescapable modernism, the Odyssey modernizing the Iliad, etc. Yet Knausgård seems to us really new and a new historical moment. We must not betray that moment. T.S. Eliot argued that the genuinely new renews antecedents, a new Joyce, Proust, etc. Does that seem right to you? Do such writers read differently now for you? Thank you, William.
So yeah, I certainly think so, right? Because every time a new writer, a new form, right? Because what we're talking about is when a new form comes in and makes its appearance. It opens our eyes to how that form has also been present in the past. It does not mean that it's the same, right? The historical circumstances, the historical moment are different. Yesterday, last night, I was participating in a seminar at Tufts University, where they're discussing non-fictional discourses. And we talked about autofiction, right? And some of the authors that came up that the students mentioned and wanted me to know, are these also autofiction, right? That was Sylvia Plath, that was Marguerite Duras, and I can remember the third one, right? And my answer to that question is of course, right? We have a number of the same traits in these authors, but the historical circumstances are, of course, different. So yes, each new writers make us see new things. And I think for Knausgård too, in one of the things that it has been interesting with him, right, is that some of the authors that he draws on, he discusses in the works, are now suddenly out throughout the Scandinavian countries, right, in new translations, and are prominently featured in bookstores. Before my struggle, Gombrovich's diaries were not available in a paperback edition in Danish, and I don't think they had ever been published in Danish. But Knausgård's continually engagement with Gombrovich in book 6 has made him into the present, and the same with Peter Hanke in a way as well, right? I mean, Knausgård is also Peter Hanke's publisher in Norway, but I think it certainly has helped seeing the qualities of Peter Hanke's earlier writings from the 70s, right? Even though, I mean, there's so many problems with Peter Hanke and him getting the Nobel Prize and so on that we, but that the appearance of new forms lets us see both authors who have inspired that, who have been hidden in the past, but also how that form has appeared, but just been undetected previously.
Thank you. That was an interesting question and an interesting answer. So the next question is from Brad Harmon, and it reads: there was mention of a contract with the reader. What are the conditions of that contract? This is about Philippe Lejeune, especially in regards to what the reader is supposed to believe or not along the fictionality line. And what ethical implications are there for the reader?
I mean, to Lejeune, like the idea of a contract or a pact with the reader, right? He actually sees it as a contract that the second we start reading a book is signed between us as readers and the author, right? And that contract determines our mode of reading. Though we as readers, right, are constantly seeking for ways to undermine that contract, and if we find too many signs of unreliability, then we shift to another contract or another mode of reading. And my point, of course, as I mentioned, right, is that these two things, they exist simultaneously, and they are able to do so for two reasons, right? First, when Knausgård describes that scene as 8-year-old, right, where he sees his neighbor with the wheelbarrow, where he feels the smell, the sound, and everything. The fact that we distrust that he can remember this much does not mean that we distrust the utterance of it, right? We probably presume that this could have happened at one point or another, that this is a collage of something that happened in his childhood. That, I think, is one point of it, right? That it's not like that the fact that it's made up does not make it a lie. And I think that's, for instance, what distinguishes Knausgård for something like James Frey. And I mean, James Frey, he lies, right? He never went to prison, for instance. And for Knausgård, by also, and that's the other side of it, being explicit about his horrid memory, he kind of acts like that detection. He does the detection for us in the unreliability of the novel. And that actually clears a pathway for us to trust him even more, right? It's a little bit like metafiction that I talked about yesterday in my Hans Christian Andersen class, right? The facts that it points to its own fictional status makes it more real. And I think that's it's the same that we find here. I hope that was an answer to that question.
Yes, very interesting answer. And just to, there is a chapter called Fiction and Trust in this book where you can read more about that. And that chapter led me to consider, in the light of its ideas, to reconsider one of my favorite recent novels by Hernan Diaz, which is called Trust. So I just want to mention that as another work of contemporary literature that deals very, very interestingly with those ideas about fictionality and trust. So,
right. And here I use, I could just say, right, I'm one of the readings I do. I use see a nice notion of tone from Ugly Feeling to characterize or a tone of distrust in book 6 of my struggle, right? A feeling that is perceived, but that no one actually feels. And that also plays into the whole idea of how we are to trust/distrust the novel.
Wonderful. So I think, as you can see from listening to Claus explain many of the ideas here, one of the great virtues of this book is that it guides you through so many different ways of thinking about the issues of fiction, fictionality, autobiography, and fiction. And it is exceptionally clear about explaining what the different theorizations have been and which ones Claus is using to explain the Knausgård phenomenon and the other writers. So I highly recommend going further with reading this book and finding out about the way these ideas are presented at greater length with the readings of My Struggle and the other authors that we've mentioned. Claus, this has been wonderful, and thank you so much for sharing your detailed, sophisticated, and clear thinking about these difficult issues with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I can see there's another question actually that just popped up. Do we have time for that?
I'm so sorry, Amanda. I did not see that. I was wrapping up. I think we can probably take it quickly. Looking forward to reading the book. Going back to the anecdote about observing the conversation between Knausgård and Fagerholm, I'm curious to hear about Fagerholm's reaction to Knausgård. Also, whether you sense Knausgård performing autofictionalization in person as a kind of star persona. In other words, do you see your theorization of autofictionalization extending beyond the literary? Might some notion of performance also come into play here? Thanks. And sorry for missing that at first. Claus?
Just to answer the last part of it, yes, of course, there's a level of performance, right? And as Toril Moy has pointed out, the Knausgård who starts writing My Struggle, right? The impoverished, lonely author sitting in Malmö is very, very different from the writer who finishes and who is a celebrated star, at least in Scandinavia at that point. When I met Knausgård in Frankfurt, it was just at the time when book 2 of My Struggle had come out in Germany, and it was very different from the. I also met him in the spring of this year, and where he was giving a talk, right, as the big literary star at an event in Denmark. But back then he came, he was humble, he was nervous, he was shaking when he did a reading from his book, and he seemed completely taken by the fact that a number of the students present wanted to go up and take a photo with him, right? That was clearly something that was new. So I think the performance of it, right? There's, of course, there was a level of a performance there as well, but it's just become even more explicit so in the years since. As to the conversation between them, it was very clearly, right, many Scandinavian authors know each other, and Fagerholm and Knausgård knew each other. And before Knausgård got there, I had been sitting talking to Fagerholm, and she was completely fascinated by Knausgård's work. And she actually, at time when she came and I listened to the conversation, right, she acted a little bit as his fans and his fan, and wanted to make sure that he signed her book. On the other hand, if you read My Struggle, you will also discover that Fagerholm is one of the only female writers that Knausgård speaks positively about, right? That is when he, for his second novel, is nominated for the Nordic Council Literary Prize at the same time as one of her novels. So I think it goes both ways.
Great. And seeing no other questions, I think that's a wonderful note to wrap up on. And thank you very much, everybody. Thank you especially to Claus, but to all the attendees for coming here to think through these issues with us in the light of Klaus's new book.